All right, AP European students, we are now ready for lecture number 2, the Cold War. So let's talk about the causes of the Cold War, then the major events of the Cold War, and we will go from there. So, the Cold War, as you know, I'm sure, from AP World, AP US, and just being a good student of understanding the world, is a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. I did that backwards, but that's okay. That took place following World War II. We know these nations don't like each other during the war. They have one thing in common, and that is defeating Nazism and Adolf Hitler. Once he is defeated, there's really not much else to bind them together. You have the differences in philosophy and economics, and so they turn against each other. Now, one of the factors, as we know, World War II is eminently based on what happened in World War I. In World War I, the Treaty of Versailles goes horribly wrong with the Germans, so we decide we're not even going to sign a formal treaty. Yes, there are discussions at Yalta and Potsdam of what to do, that we're going to divide up Germany, but that division was, at least from our perspective in the West, thought to be temporary. However, there's no formal treaty, and there is not a formal treaty ending World War II in Europe until 1990, when Germany will be reunified after the Cold War. So therefore, we just kind of sort of wing it, which turns out to be not a great idea either. So the Soviet Union, of course, travels west 1,500 miles or so to Berlin. They have been invaded twice by the Germans in the last 2 wars, 30, 40 years, and so they are concerned about a buffer, something to protect them from a next German invasion if it were to occur. Now, that is mostly an excuse. Germany is in no position to invade the Soviet Union, but of course, with her great population and industrial capacity, the thought is very soon, in a decade or 2, that will return. Of course, today Germany is the most populous, economically viable state in Europe, so that's certainly true that they would become a power again. So the Russians are determined to create a buffer state. So they just decide to stay in Eastern Europe. They have the army there, they have the weapons there, they are stronger than the people they occupy in Eastern Europe, so they just decide to stay. There's no treaty saying they can't. And the United States and Western allies are not going to get involved in that. It's too soon, we don't want to do it. There's just too many other factors at play here. So basically we just stay in Eastern Europe. So we're divided. It's called the First World, the Second World, and then we have the Third World. So broadly speaking, the United States and its Western European allies are the First World. They are nations that support democracy and capitalism. Now, when I say democracy, that is what those states will engage in. However, they also will support non-democratic states who are not communists. So, if you are a bad nation with, you throw people in jail for speaking their mind, or have values you would assume are antithetical to the United States and democracy, we don't really care. As long as you're not a communist, we will support you. And we do some pretty brutal things in the United States supporting those states during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, of course, is trying to spread communist dictatorship. Let's go all the way back to Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, 1848. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So workers of the world. So it is not paranoid to think that the Soviet Union would like to spread its ideas globally. That's been the mission from the start. So the Soviets are going to be in Eastern Europe, the Americans in Western Europe. The division is called the Iron Curtain. That term is coined by Winston Churchill in a speech he's giving in a Missouri college, Westminster, not too far from St. Louis in 1946. Churchill has more time on his hands now that he lost his seat, or lost his position as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And so he talks about an Iron Curtain. Of course, that's a metaphor. Don't do as I had a student many years ago who literally once wrote about an Iron Curtain. Where would you hang it? How would it stay up? All these questions. You know it's a metaphor, of course. So the Italians are in the west. Austria was under Soviet control, but advances to the west and is kind of neutral. Switzerland, of course, being neutral. Germany divided in half. Well, 2/3, 1/3, basically. So that's your line. Everything east of that is going to be under Soviet control. West of that is American influenced. After a couple years of occupying West Germany, we leave, along with the British and the French, and they're of their own devices. Now, the United States is going to try a couple things to promote their ideology. The Marshall Plan in 1947 is economic assistance to any nation that would promote democratic ideals, or at least not communism. We give them billions of dollars, which they will eventually repay, but it helps restart their economies, restart the building process. Also, we get the benefit of that, and we get our loans paid back eventually. We form an organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. The difference between this alliance and the alliances of World War I, these alliances are public knowledge. You know, if you fight the Belgians, you're getting the United States and Great Britain and France as well. So that's different than the secretive alliances of the World War I era. It's also voluntary. The Soviet Union Of course, those nations are not allowed in Eastern Europe to accept Marshall Plan Aid. The Soviets eventually formed the COMCON, the Community of Mutual Economic Assistance, which is their version of the Marshall Plan. We bribe to get our friends. Both sides do that quite sufficiently. In 1955, we formed the Warsaw Pact, which is their answer to NATO. Again, a mutual defense organization based in Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. Now, the one exception we'll get to in a second, not aligned, is Yugoslavia in Europe, but we'll get to them later. So the United States believes, along with their Western allies, in two things. Domino theory, that when a state becomes communist, other states around them will fall. China 1949, Korea 1950, Vietnam 1954. All these states becoming communist, next thing you know, all of Asia is going to be communist. So we've got to do everything we can to stop the spread of this ideology, which is called containment. So will we overthrow a democratically elected foreign ruler? Yes. Will we intervene and bias elections in certain? Yes. Will we support lots and lots of proxy wars? Yes. The United States and the Soviet Union, of course, will not fight each other directly during the Cold War because we have the MAD, mutually assured destruction. Once the Soviets get nuclear weapons in 1949, if the two nations start fighting each other, we will see nuclear annihilation is the theory, so we avoid that. Now, we fund numerous other conflicts around the world. Vietnam, Korea, Israel, Palestine, numerous civil wars in Africa, etc. Latin America, every continent basically is going to see proxy wars during the Cold War era because both nations are doing their best to influence every decision possible because it's about global dominance. And then the third group is going to be the non-aligned movement. These are nations, many of them as they become former colonies, become independent. They no longer desire to be controlled by European or Western influence. And so they set a third path separate from these nations, sometimes taking their money or weapons as a bribe, but never fully committing. India is a great example of this, Egypt, etc. In Europe, it's Yugoslavia. We'll talk a little bit later about Yugoslavia in a coming up lecture where we talk about their issue there. So that's the broad strokes of what the Cold War is. I imagine you knew most of that anyway. Let's talk about some of these specific events of the Cold War. Now, there are many different examples to look at, but let's look at some of those specific ideas. So, therefore, June 1948, the first one. This is called the Berlin Airlift. As you probably know, Germany is divided during the war, or after the war, excuse me. And so East Germany is under Soviet control, West Germany is under American, British, and French control. Berlin, right up here, the historic capital of Prussia and then of Germany. Berlin is decided by the West it has too much strategic value, and so the city of Berlin itself cannot be allowed to be left. So we end up forming a West Berlin that is completely democratic and capitalist in nature, surrounded by East Germany, which is communistic and dictatorial. So the Americans have to drive trucks, and the British and the French drive trucks delivering supplies into West Berlin. There are 2 million citizens of West Berlin in 1948. 2 million people. It's a lot of food that is needed, a lot of supplies, a lot of medicine. So one day in June of 1948, the Soviets just closed the border. The trucks try to drive through, and we cannot get access to these materials. So it is decided, basically, that the Soviets are going to play chicken and see what they can get away with. And so, therefore, they want to see if the Americans, how far will go to defend this policy of West Berlin remaining a viable democratic capitalist state. So we start flying in these supplies. This is called the Berlin Airlift. And so over the next 10 and a half months, we will fly over 275,000 flights, because Berlin had about 35 days of food and 45 days of fuel at that point in 1948. And so they would quickly run out. It's like siege warfare. We're going to surround the city and try to starve it out. At the height of this, a couple months into the process, there are 9,000 flights a day. That's a flight every 30 seconds landing. Not 9,000 flights a day, my bad. That is 1,500 flights a day, 9,000 tons of supplies a day, such as 648 tons of flour every single day, 109 tons of meat and fish every single day, and there is a plane landing every 30 seconds. Finally, one day in May 1949, the Soviets just open up the border again without discussion, it's just like, okay, we lost that one, so we move on. All right, in 1949, a couple things happened. NATO, as mentioned earlier, is created. The Soviet Union gets nuclear technology from spies, from the Los Alamos plant, the Rosenbergs, which you may have studied in APUS. In 1950, the Korean War begins. Korea was divided into North and South at the end of World War II. The Soviets are involved in that along with the newly communist China. The southern side, which is not democratic entirely, Syngman Rhee is a bit of a dictator. They are supported by not the United States, but by the United Nations. Now, Mr. Rich, how do we get through a United Nations mandate when the Soviet Union's on the Security Council? Well, again, this is the Cold War dance we do. Everyone knows the Soviets are behind this for the communist side, but they aren't officially behind it. It's the Chinese. And so the Chinese don't have nuclear weapons. America's not involved because, then it'd be just us and nuclear weapons, but it's the United Nations. So it's also the British and the French also putting in ideas. So both the Chinese and the Russians will abstain. And they do not vote on this issue. And so it's a United Nations-backed action in the South. And that helps create the Korean War. After 3 years, we divide the nation along the 38th parallel, which it still is today. Now, if you're interested in a good movie to watch over the course of your break, highly suggest the movie The Manchurian Candidate, which the version that came out in 1962 with Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury, about a soldier who is in the Korean War, is captured by the Soviet Union, brainwashed, and then come home to be activated as a sleeper agent to carry out acts of terrorism in the United States. Excellent Cold War film. One of my favorite Cold War films, along with Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick. Absolute masterpiece. 2 great films to recommend if you're bored over the upcoming weeks and would like something to watch. Manchurian Candidate, not the 2004 version with Denzel Washington. Love me some Denzel, but that one's not as good. The original is the best on this one. And then Dr. Strangelove, I forget what year, it's in the 60s, but from Stanley Kubrick. Okay? The Warsaw Pact is created in 1955. In 1956, we see the first true test of Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe in Hungary. Several of us were in the Eastern Europe last fall in November, and we were in Hungary, and we went to Statue Park, Memento Park, where they've taken this communist-era statues and displayed them outside of the city for historical context, and we saw a statue with just feet, a little bit of ankle. That used to be a statue of Stalin that was torn down in Budapest in 1956 as part of this revolution. It starts with students, and then it spreads to much of the rest of society. The Soviets are going to come in after only about a week and a half, and because the government of Hungary was promising to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, they were looking at having free elections, and the Soviets are going to come in and crush the rebellion. So that's the first time the Soviets let their people in Eastern Europe know this is not a choice. You are going to be under our control. You will do what we ask you to do. So they're going to flex on them. In 1956, we also see the Suez Crisis. As you may know, the Suez Canal connects the the Mediterranean Sea to bodies of water that eventually lead to the Red Sea, that allows the Europeans to travel from Europe to Asia, not going all the way around Africa as we have for hundreds of years. This drastically reduces time for shipping, which increases the journeys that can take place, which increases profit. And so the Egyptians become independent. Their leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is an Egyptian nationalist, decides that he's going to nationalize this canal, because even after Egyptian independence a couple years earlier, the canal is still controlled by the British. And he takes it over by force, nationalize it, which of course, when we talk about nationalizing something, the government of a nation taking over a private entity, that is considered communistic, and that's something we don't like. But the British don't know what to do. The British and the French are afraid that getting into a protracted struggle with an Arab state post-World War II would probably be bad. They'd probably get resupplied by their Arab neighbors. And so they try to get the United States involved. We are not interested. There's an infamous story of President Eisenhower takes a phone call from British Prime Minister Anthony Eden when this is going down in November of 1956. It happens to be election day in the United States. Evidently, Eisenhower listens for a couple minutes and then hangs up the phone in fury because he says he doesn't have time for this stuff from the British Prime Minister. So America doesn't really need to help out our allies. We have bigger things to do. And the British and the French can no longer defeat an independent Arab state militarily. World War II has changed the dynamic of the world. The British and the French are not nearly as powerful as they used to be. In 1957, we see the beginning of the space race. Sputnik, the first satellite, is launched. Could fit on my podium right here with a bunch of wires and things extending out from it, but it could fit on this podium. So that is the first satellite and begins a space race, which will continue on until the 1970s and 80s, most famously when we put the Apollo 11 astronauts on the surface of the moon in 1969. In 1959, the Cubans become communistic. This is especially concerning because it is only 90 miles south of Florida. In 1961, the Soviet Union builds the Berlin Wall in the city of Berlin. Now, what had happened for the city of Berlin, of course, had been divided, but there was no formal barrier. So for the first 16 years of that division, anyone in East Berlin could just walk to the West Berlin side. Now, there are differences, obviously, cultural differences, economic differences, but it was allowed to travel in between relatively easily. So there are millions of people in Eastern Europe who have means, who are educated, who are people who are aware of what's happening, who are having their rights stifled, their finances constricted, and they will leave their country, go to East Berlin, walk across the street, and you can get on a train and go to Paris or Amsterdam or London. Well, not London at that time, but still, they didn't have the channel yet. But you get my point. They could leave the country. You couldn't go from Budapest to Paris, but you go from Budapest to East Berlin, walk across the street, West Berlin, and then leave. So that has been happening in droves for 16 years. And instead of the Soviets questioning this choice, why would people want to leave our socialist workers' paradise, they decided to just stop it. So on the night of August the 13th, 1961, the citizens of Berlin go to bed like normal. When they wake up the next day, there's a chain link fence across the middle of the city with barbed wire on top of it. Over the next couple of months, that will turn into a wall, and there's multiple iterations of the wall over the coming decades. The official name of this wall in the Soviet sphere is the Anti-Fascist Protection Barrier. That's a good piece of propaganda right there. It ends up dividing the city. You were not told in advance. So there are people that are divided with their own family just a couple miles apart who can't see them for 28 years. This wall will be up until the fall of 1989. Now on the western side, it becomes a graffiti wall. People can go up and write on it, paint on it, express themselves, a symbol of Western values and culture. On the eastern side, we see attack dogs. We see guards with guns. We see towers. We see all sorts of crazy attempts for people to try to cross over into the west. 269 people die 239 people die trying to cross the Berlin Wall over the 28-and-a-half-year period it exists. 239 people, and some in some really inventive ways. So not only is it a physical division between the two sides in this issue, it's also a metaphor for the differences culturally on the West, freedom of expression, values, art, poetry, culture. On the East, it is the oppression and denying people the opportunity to get anywhere near it, but without being physically harmed. So it's a good symbol of the differences as well. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we discover, the United States does in a series of spy plane overviews, that we see nuclear missiles being placed in Cuba, pointed at us. Of course, the United States has had nuclear missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union for several years. Over the next 13 days, there's a lot of concern, worry. My parents were both in high school at the time. I've heard stories of my mother talking about having to do nuclear weapons drills in her classes in high school where you would get under the desk, just like you would today in an earthquake drill. Wouldn't do much good, but that was at least the logic, to give people something they feel like they can do to stop all this madness. And so it's a very concerning time. Eventually we agree to remove our missiles. They agree to remove their missiles, and World War III is averted, probably the closest we ever got. Now, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, we'll talk about him later. He is going to be removed from power about a year and a half later by military takeover because the generals are upset that he, quote, gave in to the West. Thankfully he did so, because without it we might not be alive today. So that's a very good thing that happened. All right, in 1968 we had the so-called Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Prague, the capital of today the Czech Republic, back then Czechoslovakia. In January of 1968, they have a period of beginning of political liberalization. Now in Hungary in 56, this lasted for about a week and a half, where the Soviets smashed it. In 1968, we will see this last until August. That's why it's called the Prague Spring. It encompasses the spring. There's actually hope that the Soviets will allow this to happen. We have a guy named Alexander Dubček who talks about socialism with the human face. This, of course, would be some political liberalization. Freedom of the press, some free elections. Those are the kind of things that we're talking about. Also the ability to travel and leave the country and leave outside the Soviet sphere were all proposed by Dubček. And there's actual hope when we enter month 4, month 5, month 6. This might actually take place. We're not entirely sure what caused the delay, but finally in 1968 in August, in come the tanks, much like in Hungary in 56, and we smash it. Dubček is removed from power. and we see the end of that process. The Soviet Union again reigns supreme. Now, the leader at the time was named Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev will therefore produce his doctrine, his namesake eponymous doctrine, the Brezhnev Doctrine. And the Brezhnev Doctrine will be in place for the next 2 decades in Soviet sphere. The Soviet Union reserves the right to conquer or invade any of its satellite nations in the Eastern Bloc to assert its dominance. So they can go into Poland, they can go into Hungary, they can go into Romania at any time if they want to. And that's the Brezhnev Doctrine, which of course most of the people in these states are not afraid of their own governments as much. They're afraid of the Soviets coming home and causing chaos and violence. Now, that seems like that's an interesting policy, especially when contrasted with the next one. 1969, Brezhnev enters into, at that time, with the new president of America, Richard Nixon, with détente. Détente means a lessening. So we're going to try to ease some of our tensions. We negotiate treaties. We try to limit nuclear weapons. A couple examples. We have the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which takes place in 1969. And the purpose, 72, was to limit the number of nuclear missiles in the world. Both sides had over 10,000 nuclear missiles, which could destroy the world many times over if used. Of course, we work around this. We create multiple rockets that can go, or multiple missiles can go on each rocket. So we have less rockets, but we have more nuclear missiles per rocket. So it doesn't really do a whole lot of good, but it sounds nice if you're not paying attention. And again, we don't know all the details of what happens until after the Cold War. We open up the Soviet archives and we can do some research on that country. In 1975, we have the Helsinki Accords, where the West agrees that the Soviets control Eastern Europe, but the Soviets agree to promote human rights more effectively, so that they'll try to be more mindful of the concerns and needs of Soviet citizens and those in Eastern Europe. So that's the Helsinki Accords, 1975. They're not a treaty, so it's not as binding. Of course, it doesn't mean a whole lot. We still have people in prison and people being oppressed in the Soviet sphere. Probably the biggest event of this time period, in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. I'll talk more about it in the end of the Cold War video, but it is going to have a major impact on Soviet policy, economics, press, the media, the feelings of the average person. It has often been compared to the United States and our conflict in Vietnam, which I think is a very excellent comparison. Because of this, in 1980, the United States and some other Western nations boycott the Soviet Olympics that are supposed to be held, the Summer Olympics in Moscow. And we boycott those Olympics, which is a huge statement in terms of the Cold War. Also in 1980, we see an anti-communist movement in Poland called Solidarity. It actually starts in a shipyard in Gdansk. Gdansk is a city on the Baltic Sea. It's actually started, let's take a quick trip around the classroom here. Started in a shipyard led by this gentleman, a guy named Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa is a welder. He is not a man of great education or any political experience, but Solidarity is a labor union. Now, as you may remember, in the Soviet system, in communism, we don't need labor unions. We are a workers' paradise. All of our workers are treated fairly and equitably, so we do not need a union. But this one forms. Now, they are disbanded. They are not allowed to continue, but they are not killed. They don't end up in a gulag somewhere. Lech Walesa goes back to work after brief imprisonment. And so we're kind of like, okay, so they didn't let us do it, but they also didn't kill us. So is that a positive thing? Is that, and now, of course, at the time, we don't see any other movements in Eastern Europe, but looking back a decade later when communism ends in Eastern Europe, we do see it as a trend that begins with the Solidarity movement in Poland. Also part of that is in 1979, we get a new pope. His name is John Paul II. He is Polish. Polish is a heavily Catholic nation. And so he actively promotes communist resistance when he visits his home country and tells his people to fight for freedom and whatnot. And so that is something not expected to be politically engaged with the Pope. But he supports non-communism pretty actively and is a Pole that is going to inspire his fellow countrymen to support that ideology as well. In the early 1980s, we also see the new American president, a guy named Ronald Reagan, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Reagan is no longer interested in détente. It dies with his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. Reagan is all about the evil empire. We will crush them. He starts spending money like crazy, doing a lot of non-communist interventions in Latin America, for example, in the Middle East. And so he is going to ramp up American military expenditure quite significantly. My personal favorite example, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, Star Wars as it is nicknamed, an attempt to create space lasers to shoot down nuclear weapons. If you've ever seen a 1980s computer, you know the ridiculousness of this. And it never works. But the fact that we spend billions of dollars on it, guess what the Soviets do? They start spending billions of dollars on it as well. And the difference is we can afford it even though we go into great debt in the 80s because of it. They can't. And so it will exacerbate or hasten their economic decline that will result in their collapse just a couple years later. And then in 1987, President Reagan goes to Berlin, standing in front of the Berlin Wall, and gives a very famous speech. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's on YouTube. Watch it if you're interested. Pretty interesting. And so it's that aggressive tone that is partially going to be responsible for getting the nations of the West to support the end of communism in Europe. So those are some of the major events of the Cold War. Obviously, there's many, many others, but those are just a few. So we'll stop this lecture at this time. We will continue with lecture number 3, which is about the end of the Cold War. Okay.